Field trips are supposed to be fun, right? A break from the routine of the classroom, an adventure with friends. But sometimes, those fun-filled days can turn into unforgettable nightmares. Tonight, we'll dive into 5 true stories of field trips that took a dark and terrifying turn. These aren't your typical ghost stories, they're real experiences, and they'll leave you thinking twice before boarding that next bus. Let's begin, if you dare. The abandoned cabin encounter. It was supposed to be a fun day. A group of high school students out on a nature field trip in the heart of a remote forest. Sun was shining, the air was fresh, and everything felt perfectly normal until they found it. While walking along the trail, someone spotted something through the trees. First, it looked like just a shadow, but as they got closer, they realized it was an old cabin, run down, forgotten, and completely out of place. Curiosity got the better of them. They weren't supposed to leave the trail, but how could they resist? The cabin seemed abandoned, but the door was slightly open. It was waiting for them. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dirt. But the strangest thing? Markings. Strange symbols scratched into the walls, on the floors, everywhere they looked. One of the students joked that it was just some old graffiti. But the others? They weren't so sure. Something felt off. Air inside was heavy, and it felt like they were being watched. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from one of the rooms in the back. They froze, hearts racing. No one wanted to admit it, but they were scared. One of them, the bravest, or maybe the most foolish, decided to check it out. They walked toward the noise. The others waited in silence. Minutes passed, and without warning, the student who had gone to investigate came running back, pale as a ghost. "There's something in there," they whispered, eyes wide with fear. "Something's moving." Panic set in and the group rushed out of the cabin, footsteps pounding against the forest floor. But the terror didn't stop when they left. That night, back at camp, things started to happen. Items went missing, small things like a water bottle or a jacket. At first, they thought they had just misplaced them, but then they found the jacket, hanging from a tree, deep in the woods, near where the cabin stood. No one could explain how it got there, and that was just the beginning. Throughout the night, they heard whispers, low, faint, but unmistakable. It was like something was circling their tents, just outside the light of the campfire, watching, waiting. The next morning, they packed up and left, cutting the trip short. None of them ever spoke about it again, but those who were there never forgot, because whatever they found in that cabin, it wasn't human, and it wasn't finished with them. Bus ride that never ended. It started like any other school trip, a bus full of students laughing and chatting on their way to a local museum. The sun was shining, the teachers were relaxed, and everyone was excited for a day away from school, but none of them knew that they would never reach their destination, not in the way they expected. Everything seemed fine at first. The bus rolled down the highway, landscape passing by like any other trip. But then, the driver took a wrong turn. No one thought much of it. It happens, right? Just a quick detour. But the road they ended up on was different. It was narrow, winding, and surrounded by thick trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The students started to notice that something was off when they passed the same crooked tree for the third time. At first, they thought it was a coincidence. Maybe all trees looked alike out there. Then they saw the same old rusted sign that had clearly fallen over years ago, again and again. Hours passed. The bus kept driving, but they weren't getting anywhere. The sky, which had been bright earlier, was now a dull, grayish hue. The trees outside seemed to close in, and the road, well, it never seemed to end. The driver's face had grown tense. He kept glancing at the road map. Nothing made sense. He tried turning around, taking different routes. No matter what he did, they always ended up in the same place. Same crooked tree, same rusted sign. By now, the laughter had faded. The students sat in uneasy silence, feeling like they were trapped in some kind of loop. That's when the whispers began. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. Slowly, it grew louder, like a low murmur coming from outside the bus. Students looked out the windows, but there was no one there. The endless road and those same looming trees. The driver decided to stop at an old gas station that appeared out of nowhere, an old rundown shack with a single flickering light. Desperate for help, he got out to ask for directions, but the attendant, something wasn't right about him. His eyes were dark, and his smile was wide. Too wide. Spoke in a voice that didn't match his appearance. Too deep and slow, like he was speaking through something else. He gave the driver directions, but they didn't make sense. The driver hesitated, but had no choice. He got back on the bus and followed the new route. They drove further, the whispers grew louder. This time, they could hear their names. Students' names whispered one by one. Then the bus jolted. The sky darkened completely, and the trees outside became twisted twisted shadows. Road beneath them disappeared into blackness. The students held their breath, gripping their seats. Just when they thought they would never escape, the bus suddenly burst out of the forest. We're back on the main road, heading toward the museum. It was over, or so they thought. When they finally arrived at the museum, something was wrong. The trip had only taken 30 minutes according to the clock, but to everyone on that bus, it felt like they'd been driving for hours, maybe even days. To this day, some of those students swear that sometimes, when they're alone at night, they still hear the whispers, calling their names. The Forgotten Tunnel. It was supposed to be just another history field trip. A group of middle school students visiting an old historical site, walking through the grounds where generations before them had lived and worked. The kind of trip where you take notes, snap a few photos, try to stay awake during the guide's speech. But for this group, that day became something far more sinister. The site was an old estate, abandoned for decades. The teachers led the students through crumbling halls, past faded portraits and rusted tools, telling stories of the people who once lived there. But the real story began when a few students strayed away from the group. It started as innocent curiosity. A small group of friends spotted something hidden behind a pile of old bricks near the edge of the property. At first glance, it looked like a collapsed section of the house. But then, they noticed something strange. An opening, a dark, narrow tunnel leading deep underground. The students knew they shouldn't go in, but something about it pulled them closer. One by one, they squeezed through the gap, their phones lighting the way as they ventured into the forgotten passage. The tunnel was long and damp, the air thick and musty, as if it hadn't been touched in years. As they walked further, the sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally. Every step felt louder, heavier, like something was moving just behind them. But when they turned around, there was nothing. Only darkness. It wasn't long before they started seeing strange things. The walls of the tunnel were lined with old, crumbling bricks, but every now and then, they spotted carvings, symbols scratched into the stone, long and jagged like someone had been in a hurry. None of them could understand what the symbols meant, but they didn't have time to figure it out, because that's when the noises started. At first, it was just soft whispers, distant, the wind blowing through the tunnel. But then the whispers grew louder, closer. The students tried to convince themselves it was just the wind, but deep down they knew it wasn't. Something was down there with them. One of the students, the last in line, stopped. She swore she saw a shadow move in the corner of her eye. When she turned to look, it was gone. As the group pushed forward, the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The light from their phones barely cut through the darkness, and soon they realized they were lost. Panic set in. The whispers grew into distant footsteps, echoing through the tunnel, following them at every turn. No matter which way they ran, the footsteps were always just behind them. Then, at the far end of the tunnel, they saw it. A figure, tall, dark, standing completely still. For a moment, none of them moved. They stared, frozen in place, as the figure seemed to watch them from the shadows. But when they blinked, it was gone. Terrified, the students ran back the way they came, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they finally burst through the tunnel's opening, back into the light of day, they were shaken, out of breath, but safe, so they thought. When they returned to the group and told their teacher what they had found, she was confused. There was no tunnel on the estate's map, and when she asked the site's caretaker about it, his face turned pale. The tunnel they described, he said, had been sealed off over 100 years ago. There was no way they could have entered it, but they had, and to this day, the students still remember the darkness and the figure that had been waiting for them inside. The haunted hotel room. It was supposed to be a fun overnight trip, a high school class staying at an old, charming hotel after a long day of exploring a nearby town. Everyone was excited, chatting and unpacking, looking forward to the next day's adventures. But for two students, horror began the moment they were assigned to room 217. The hotel was old, historic, the kind of place where everything creaked and the walls seemed to hold secrets. At first, it didn't seem like anything unusual. The two students, friends who had shared rooms before on trips, were happy to settle in, but something felt off as soon as they entered the room. The air inside was cold, not the normal kind of cold that comes from an overactive air conditioner, but a deep, bone-chilling cold that lingered in the corners, creeping along the walls. They joked about it at first, laughing nervously as they unpacked. But then, strange things started happening. It began with small, almost unnoticeable things. The TV remote disappeared, only to be found sitting in the middle of the bed, and neither of them had touched it. A hairbrush moved from the bathroom counter to the desk, even though both swore they hadn't gone near it. But the real terror began that night. As the students lay in their beds trying to sleep, they heard it. Tapping. Soft at first, barely noticeable, coming from the window. They brushed it off as the wind or maybe a tree branch, but then it grew louder, a steady, rhythmic tapping, as if someone, or something, was outside. The problem was their room was on the 8th floor. The tapping continued, and with each knock, the unease grew. One of the students finally gathered the courage to get up and check the window. Slowly, they pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see nothing. But when they looked outside, there was nothing there, just the empty night and a long drop to the street below. They tried to shake it off, but the room felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. That's when they heard it, the soft sound of crying. It was faint, almost like it was coming from the closet. Both of them froze, listening as the quiet sobs filled the room. Gathering all their courage, they opened the closet door, but it was empty. Nothing inside but their clothes. Yet the crying continued, growing louder, echoing from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Just when they thought it couldn't get any worse, one of the students, wide-eyed with fear, saw something at the foot of her bed. A girl standing silently, dressed in a tattered old dress, her eyes dark and hollow. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring. The other students sat up, but by the time she looked, the girl was gone. Panic set in, and the two students bolted from the room, running down the hall until they found their teacher. They begged to switch rooms, explaining what had happened, but the hotel staff looked confused. They were told there was no room 217 on their floor. According to the floor plan, the room they had been staying in was actually room 218. Confused and shaken, they spent the rest of the night in the lobby, refusing to go back upstairs. When morning came, they left the hotel without looking back. This day, those students swear they saw something that night, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And while the hotel staff never confirmed any hauntings, rumors still spread about that room. Room 217 or 218, depending on who you ask. No matter what it's called, everyone agrees on one thing. Whatever haunted that room still lingers. The unseen followers, slow and unnerving. A field trip to a wildlife reserve sounds like the perfect way to spend the day. Fresh air, open fields, maybe a glimpse of some animals in their natural habitat. But for one student, this trip quickly turned into a nightmare where they realized they were being followed, not by a person, but by something they couldn't see. It started like any other trip. A group of students exploring the wildlife reserve, cameras in hand, snapping photos of birds and flowers. Everything felt normal, calm, almost peaceful. But for one student, wrong. From the moment they stepped off the bus, there was this strange, heavy feeling, like eyes were on them. At first, they brushed it off as nerves or just their imagination. But as the day went on, feeling got stronger. No matter where they went, it was there, that constant sensation of being watched. The group wandered deeper into the reserve, following the trails through thick forests and open clearings. The student tried to shake the feeling, focusing on the sights around them, but it wasn't enough. That's when they started noticing the shadows. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of their eye, something darting behind a tree, just out of sight. They turned, expecting to see another student, but there was no one, just the trees swaying in the breeze. The student shrugged it off, but the shadows kept appearing, always in the corner of their vision, always vanishing before they could get a good look. It wasn't until the group stopped for lunch that things got worse. As the others sat down to eat, the student felt a cold breeze brush against the back of their neck. It wasn't windy. The air had been still all day, but that breeze felt icy. Someone was standing right behind them, breathing down their neck. When they turned around, no one was there, but something wasn't right. The hair on their arms stood on end. They could feel it. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to leave them alone. After lunch, the group continued their hike. The student couldn't shake the feeling. They started to notice things that no one else did. A rustling in the bushes when the air was still. A faint whisper carried on the wind, calling their name. Desperate for answers, the student took out their camera, hoping to capture whatever was following them. They snapped a few pictures, their heart racing. Nothing showed up in the photos, at least not at first. Later, when they reviewed the images, saw it. In one photo, taken near a dense cluster of trees, was a shape, a blurry, dark figure standing just behind them. They hadn't seen it in person. The camera had. By the time the field trip ended, the student was on edge, barely able to keep it together. As they boarded the bus, they couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been following them was still there, just out of sight. Watching, waiting. Back at home, the feeling didn't go away. Followed them, even when they were miles from the reserve. Night, they would wake up, pounding, convinced that something was standing in the corner of their room, just outside the reach of the light. They never returned to the wildlife reserve. To this day, they can't explain what followed them that day. But one thing is certain, whatever it was, it never stopped.